You know, we talk a lot about Pontius Pilate during this time, and he's always portrayed as the really bad guy, but a couple interesting things here about Pontius Pilate and his wife.
In a world where power and justice collide, one woman stood quietly on the sidelines of history. Claudia, wife of Pontius Pilate. As the crowd roared for Jesus' condemnation, Claudia was in a moral whirlwind, torn between her loyalty to her husband and the undeniable innocence of the man before her. As each twist and turn took its course, her internal battle heightened, and what happened next would change her forever. Join us as we delve deep into this thrilling story of power, guilt, and that unforgettable moment when the greatest injustice in history was perpetrated right in front of her. Join us as we look deeper into the quiet woman who stood at the crossroads of history, holding the power to alter fate with a single word. Claudia Procula. Claudia Procula, the wife of Pontius Pilate, is hardly mentioned in historical literature, though she was present at events that would change the course of history. As the wife of the Roman governor of Judea, Claudia watched with silent vigilance as the situation around her began to deteriorate. But who was this woman, standing at the center of Jesus' trial and crucifixion, holding a secret that could have changed everything? Claudia was noted for the subtlety of her beauty and her Roman roots, and she had arrived in Jerusalem with Pilate when he took over the province's government. While Pilate faced the pressures of the place, religious and political, Claudia lived a reserved but attentive life. As the wife of a famous man, she could gain entry into places few would dare tread, and it was in such settings that Jesus' presence slowly became more real to her, almost imperceptibly so. While most of the Roman nobles disregarded stories about Jesus as mere tales, Claudia could not shut out the presence of this man. With every report about his miracles and teachings, she felt rising curiosity. News of the power of Jesus among people stirred something inside her. She couldn't quite realize what that was. Like many of her time, Claudia Procula lived her life torn between the values of her Roman culture and the mystery of Jesus. This inner dualism only increased in Claudia as Jesus' fate gradually reached a crossroads. She could not understand how a man preaching peace and love could be perceived to be threatening the power of Rome. And with each passing day, something within her signaled that, indeed, Pilate was to play the most fateful role in this story. It grew stronger, leading Claudia to experiences that were to change her. Living alongside Pontius Pilate meant a life of privileges, but also a certain discomfort for Claudia. She was a respectable wife, being the spouse of the Roman governor of Judea, but she also carried the weight of closely witnessing the role Pilate played in that land of constant tensions. She watched the challenges he faced, yet she didn't agree with all of the choices and policies that he adopted to keep such passionate people and the unstable region under control. For Claudia, who observed the scenes of the battle on the streets and the triumph of the Romans over the Jews, it was not associated with comfort. Contrary to this, the more she was exposed to the bleakness of the environment she found herself in, the more she felt that the empire to which she belonged was fighting an enemy that was grounded on a divine principle, faith, as she could not quite grasp, but faith she could herself see was profound, and the figure of Jesus, an increasingly famous name to gain more supporters in Jerusalem, was the opposite of everything the Roman culture was trying to suppress. His authority, a way of instilling fear and demanding compliance, made Claudia uncomfortable as the wife of Pilate. She could not afford to watch her husband dealing with crises in Jerusalem with such ruthlessness, especially among the Antichrist followers of Jesus. To Pilate, the carpenter was an opponent of the state, and while Claudia felt that there was something different, something special about this faith was increasingly winning the hearts of the people, her heart told her that she knew better than her own culture to deny her deep intuition about Jesus because she had been baptized as a Christian. Far more painful for her were the moments that prepared a major decision that Pilate would have to make. Claudia, who possessed good intuition for such things, understood that the tension was growing around Jesus, and soon her husband would have to make a choice. Jesus' fate. Her heart squeezed at the thought that Pilate was chosen to be at the helm in passing judgment on the face of someone people had so earnestly placed their hope on as their savior. The fact that Claudia found herself struggling between responsibility and what her personal feelings informed her puts her in the conviction that this would transform her. What if a single dream, one that shook her to the core, held the power to change the course of history. Next, let's explore how Claudia's vision would push her to take a stand that could defy everything she knew. The dream and pleading with Pilate. One night, Claudia had a dream that left her greatly troubled. It wasn't just any dream. She saw Jesus standing amid a lot of light, and the weightiness of suffering seemed to burden him. He strode, calm-faced, and stared at the horizon as if he didn't know what was in store for him. This particular dream shook her to the core, and she woke up in a cold sweat, still feeling the intensity of Jesus' stare. Normally, Claudia tried to dismiss such visions she had periodically. However, this time, something was different. That dream had a call she could not understand, an unbearable need to protect Jesus, to ascertain that he was unharmed. She had no doubts that something terrible would occur if Pilate proceeded with the verdict. Still in confusion, and with sad feelings inside, Claudia went to Pilate that morning. She opened her eyes wide, and with a shaky voice, she pleaded with him not to participate in the condemnation of Jesus. She attempted, as far as she could, to persuade him that this judgment was not political nor religious, but spiritual. It was something beyond the jurisdiction of Rome and the law. She narrated the dream to Pilate, and then explained how her soul was consumed with anguish that Pilate could not overlook. Pilate looked at the situation practically and did not believe Claudia's words. To him, that was nothing more than a dream of his wife and was a mere inconvenience. He attempted to reassure her with rough words, but Claudia got the feeling that her shrill cry went unanswered. She realized that if Jesus were condemned, something bad would occur, which left her helpless to fear for the future of all those surrounding her. Despite all the efforts she could make to avert the tragedy, she was fully convinced that the end was inevitable, and that perception was going to torment her for the rest of the days that followed, in what she would describe as a living nightmare. Claudia was still affected by the dream days after, and was caught with a difficult decision to make. She felt the need to prevent Pilate from passing any verdict on Jesus, but she well understood that this meant risking the dignity her husband had for her. However, she still felt the urge to deal with Pilate. She realized this was an opportunity to speak or remain silent for the rest of her life, with the conscience of the tragedy. The next morning, Claudia steeled herself and went to Pilate. Her face resembled the pale corpse, which was depicted in anguish and chronic fear. More softly but seriously, she stressed once more that she should never touch the judgment of Jesus. Softly pleading, she said that Jesus was innocent and something much greater was at work here. Claudia pleaded with Pilate that the empire should not be blamed for sending an innocent person to the cross, but Pilate reacted bitterly. To him, Claudia was being controlled by a sheer sense of superstition, which he feared affected her logic. Pilate listened to the pressures and understood that, as the governor, he ought to make concrete decisions. The Romans could not allow a slip or weakness, and most importantly, they were ahead of a man whom many deemed a threat. Claudia could see Pilate's rigor and the need to accomplish his duties, but she tried one last time to convince him. She pleaded with him to at least think before arriving at the decision, but Pilate gave her a cold shoulder. Claudia realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get through to the thick skin of the Pilate. As Pilate prepared for trial, she felt that a sad moment was coming her way. The encounter and trial. On the day of the trial, Claudia felt that something very wrong was about to happen. Jerusalem was tense, with the sounds of mumbling, yelling, and discomfort filling the halls of Pilate's palace. Claudia stood and watched the tribunal where her husband, Pontius Pilate, had to make a complicated decision. Claudia knew Pilate disliked being influenced, but also realized the pressure exerted by the mobs, with the need to restore order among the public to prevent chaos. There was very high tension, especially by Pilate, who looked tired and serious as he assumed the responsibility. When the trial was progressing, Claudia experienced torment. It seemed to her that justice was sent not only for Jesus, but for the future of her own family and the whole region. She caught only scraps of the charges being said, referring to the miracles and the Roman oppression that Jesus instigated. The name of Jesus was yelled out, and accusations against the empire and of blasphemy were heard across the courtroom. Claudia knew that the husband's decision would not be made depending solely on what he considered right, but also due to the reluctance to escalate the conflict further. For a second she thought that Pilate could waver, but in response to the mob's shouts outside, she realized that Jesus' fate was already sealed. The counselors and priests wanted to stop Jesus, and they continued to pressure Pilate to make his final call. Claudia wondered why she had wasted the previous night asking for his reconsideration. Pilate was having this dilemma of whether to grant the plea of the empire or the plea of the people. Claudia had to leave the trial before the end. The things that were said and the loads of accusations left her overwhelmed. Claudia was convinced that there was nothing that could stop the tragedy of Jesus' death. Claudia watched anxiously as the pressure from the crowd grew stronger. The people furiously demanded an immediate and severe decision against Jesus. The shouts and murmurs made the atmosphere in the courtroom unbearable. She knew her husband, Pontius Pilate, was being put in a very tight spot to make a tough decision. Normally, Pilate was cold and calculating, but he now appeared disturbed by the situation. Claudia could almost see his face of fatigue and indecision, as if he were fighting some internal battle. He made attempts to quiet the crowd, but was promptly defeated by the unrelenting pressure from the religious leaders, who demanded an immediate condemnation of Jesus. Claudia watched anxiously as the pressure from the crowd grew stronger. The crowd was not ready to be compromised. Campaigns for blood went on until even shrieks for mercy could not penetrate through the noise. Claudia was frustrated because her voice became silent, just like her husband, who appeared to be helpless in front of the people who forced a particular decision that could not be stopped anymore. Seeing the tension rise in Pilate, she thought he had already made his decision, which for him was a death sentence. When Pilate finally washed his hands in the presence of the masses, Claudia grew extremely cold. It was not only sealing Jesus' fate, but distancing himself from something he knew, in a way, was irreversible. Observing her husband's last efforts, Claudia realized that the parties could no longer change anything. For Claudia, it was filled with emptiness after the trial, wherein Jesus was given a death sentence. The young woman went back to her chambers in the palace, but what used to be a warm and secure place appeared dull and dark. A feeling of discomfort seized her, and the feeling of helplessness was palpable. It was as if the whole city of Jerusalem had been overcast with some dark and oppressive clouds. After the verdict, Claudia was observing Pilate, who had remained silent after the trial. She had realized that his act of washing his hands before the crowd would not be enough to clear his conscience. She knew the guilt would never be forgotten. For Claudia, the appeared to be even deeper. She found herself believing that the real struggle was something much bigger. The appearance of Christ, who did not say a word when accused, now fell upon her again. With each tick on the clock, she was certain that her bid to protect Jesus was futile. And now all that was left was to stand and watch from a distance the events that would unfold in the next few hours. As the day wore on, the palace seemed strange and silent, as if everyone knew that something irreversible had happened. Claudia felt small and helpless. As a witness to a tragedy, she could do nothing to stop. The voices and cries of the crowd still echoed in her mind, and she knew that her life and that of her husband would always bear the imprint of what they had allowed to happen. When Claudia heard the rumors that Jesus was being taken to be tortured, it devastated her. She tried, unsuccessfully, to push away the image of that innocent man whom she had seen only once, but could never forget. Now, Jesus was in the hands of cruel soldiers who would do whatever it took to destroy him, both physically and spiritually. Claudia felt powerless, and the suffering that consumed her was real as she was about to witness an irreparable atrocity. The news that kept arriving only intensified her anguish. Jesus had been beaten, humiliated, and crowned with thorns. The cruelty of the soldiers, who mocked him and treated him as if he were a dangerous criminal, seemed incomprehensible to Claudia. She couldn't understand how someone who had always preached peace, love, and compassion could be treated with such brutality. With every new report, she felt more and more guilty, and as though the world around her was irreversibly sinking into darkness. With every passing moment, Claudia felt that her intuition, her plea, and even the dream she had were warnings that something terrible was going to happen. She experienced an intense repulsion to the situation, but at the same time, a painful curiosity drove her to want to know more about what Jesus was facing. It was as if his suffering was part of a much greater plan, something beyond human comprehension, and this left her torn between fear and a sense of reverence. Claudia soon realized that nothing she did could change Jesus' fate. She was merely a spectator, a powerless figure caught between Roman power and the mystery of that man. At that moment, her life would never be the same. Claudia had long avoided getting involved in the issues that troubled her husband, but in a brief and unexpected moment, her eyes met Jesus' gaze. That vision touched her in a way she couldn't explain. Jesus was unlike anyone Claudia had ever met. His face was serene and deep, as if he held some silent, complete knowledge behind his eyes, even in the midst of such suffering. In those few seconds, Claudia felt something she had never experienced when she looked at another human. There was a silent strength in his gaze, and an overwhelming compassion. Jesus looked beyond the apparency, as if he had looked into the soul of whoever was watching him. The encounter was so quick that Claudia did not have much time to register how she felt, though those few seconds were enough to disturb her quite a lot. In him, she saw something that was beyond human comprehension, a mystery that, at the same time, gave her hope and filled her with an inexplicable fear. She couldn't help but remember the power in that gaze that followed her everywhere, as though Jesus knew everything that was to come, and with great serenity, he accepted his fate. Claudia had never seen anyone with such peace of mind, even when the person knew what was coming. Amidst all the terror and desperation around her, he kept beaming with a force she couldn't fathom. The vision affected her profoundly. She couldn't understand how anyone wanted to hurt such a man. From that encounter, Claudia felt more torn than ever. She wished, more than ever, that Pilate had paid heed to her request, that he could have averted the condemnation, but deep inside, she knew it was too late. All she had now was the embittering thought of having been an eyewitness of that moment, and carrying the memory of the gaze that would change her forever. On the crucifixion day, Claudia was beside herself. She sat in her silent chambers and heard the news brought to her that Jesus had been nailed upon the cross, the last cruel and degrading end to a life being worked out. Yet, amid such violence, there was a strange peace in the air. Even at the moment of his death, Claudia could feel the tragedy was almost unbearable. Claudia didn't dare to follow the procession closely, but at the same time, she couldn't stop her thoughts from drifting to what was happening. It was as if some invisible force made her feel every step Jesus took along the Via Dolorosa, each fall, each blow he got from the Roman soldiers. She knew this was the end of a man who did not deserve such a fate he had been condemned to, and the weight of guilt was heavy in her heart. Without uttering a word, Claudia retired to a corner of the palace, where, in solitude, she attempted to pray or meditate to appease the anguish that tormented her. As time went by, and the moment of the crucifixion approached, she had already foreseen that terrible scene. Jesus, nailed on the cross, suffering in front of a crowd that watched him. The images overtook her mind, and she tried unsuccessfully to push them away. She felt helpless, but, at the same time, was connected with him. It was as if she was there in every second of his agony. Finally, when she learned that Jesus had been raised on the cross, Claudia couldn't hold back the tears. The pain was deep inside her, like an invisible wound. Though she had never fully understood who Jesus was or what he represented, she knew this man carried a sacred purpose, a burden no one would ever fully comprehend. And now he was being crucified, exposed to the world and the brutality that, in some way, she and her husband had allowed. At this very moment, Claudia knew that everything that had gone on inside her would never again be the same. It was not just the death of an innocent man, Jesus, but it seemed the end of all hope and light he had brought. It was one of those days stamped into her brain for all eternity. The image of Jesus was simple and unforgettable for Claudia. Seeing him, she saw a striking figure whose countenance did not fit with anything she had expected. Dark-skinned, typical of people from that region, marked by the sun and time spent outdoors, reflecting a life of labor and simplicity. Claudia watched how he melted into the crowd, his features like theirs in so many ways, an ordinary man. And yet, there was something in his presence that was different, profoundly so. Jesus' eyes were brown and deep, drawing Claudia in. There was an intensity in them that was hard to explain, as if they carried wisdom and compassion beyond his physical appearance. Looking into them felt like diving into an ocean of emotions and meanings, as if he could see everyone's soul. Claudia felt that Jesus' eyes carried so much peace that they questioned everything she had ever believed. Jesus' hair was dark, almost black, and slightly wavy, falling naturally around his face. There were no adornments or signs of vanity. Though messy from walking in the wind, His strands calmly framed his face as if they were part of his simple, humble identity. Claudia noticed that he had a rugged, genuine look that made him even more striking, for it reflected the true essence of the people. Jesus' face was soft-featured, reflecting peace, even when the body was under torture. His dark beard outlined his face with subtlety, bringing into prominence his strength and steadfastness through the hours of his sorrows. There was nothing Roman in the dominance of features. But what if this man, who appeared so ordinary, was far more than anyone realized? Join us as we dive into the transformative effect Jesus had on Claudia, a woman torn between love, duty, and the truth she could no longer ignore. Claudia knew that Jesus' true presence was not in a striking physical beauty, but in how his expression radiated compassion and strength. To Claudia, Jesus represented something other than his time and culture. His simplicity and the details of his appearance would remain in her mind forever, like the image of an ordinary man in the eyes of the world, but extraordinary in his essence and mission. Pilate knew he was under pressure from the people and the Jews, so he tried to judge well, but all his choices were hard to decide in an atmosphere of tension. Claudia watched her husband, mixing her concern and sadness. She could tell the inner fight that dominated him. Pilate was a man used to making impartial decisions, but there was something in the presence of Jesus that seemed to tie him in a way he had never seen. Every word he said, every attempt to appease the crowd, showed how consumed he was by the difficulty of making a decision that could completely alter the course of his life. And Jesus did not reply to any provocation or accusation. His eyes stared with firm serenity, showing quiet strength. Claudia felt he was different from any other defendant. He did not plead his case or justify himself. He stood with his head hung low, a mixture of acceptance and resignation, as if he knew his fate was sealed. That was an instant of great intensity for Claudia. She had never seen a person so at peace while knowing he was about to be condemned. When Pilate finally asked the crowd what should be done with Jesus, and they shouted, "Crucify him!" Claudia almost felt her pain deep inside her physical being. She knew the pressure her husband was under, yet she couldn't accept this verdict being pronounced. At that moment, she realized that everything she feared was now about to happen, and there was nothing more she could do to stop it. Graven in Claudia's mind was the image of Jesus in silence, not resisting. His peace and acceptance in the face of judgment touched her soul and made her question all that she believed about power and justice. Claudia had never felt despair like that when she heard that Jesus had been taken to Golgotha. Every second was silent torture as she envisioned him suffering. She couldn't get the image of him being nailed to the cross out of her mind. The muffled sounds of pain and the weight of that injustice crushed her soul. News hard to believe reached the palace. Jesus, after being violently beaten, had carried the cross to the place of execution, where he was nailed and raised in front of everyone. The heat, the weight of the wood, and the wounds on his body made the scene almost impossible to imagine. Claudia couldn't understand such brutality. The image of his calm face during the trial now contrasted with the idea of his torn body on the cross, something that would haunt her forever. Claudia tried to pray, to ask the Roman gods for some relief or meaning amid so much injustice, but she felt as if her prayers went unanswered, as though they fell into an abyss. She was consumed by a deep anguish, feeling like a powerless spectator, unable to do anything to ease Jesus' suffering. The guilt of not convincing Pilate to change his decision was a heavy burden to bear. But what if the events that followed the crucifixion weren't just rumors? Join us as we uncover how the world around Claudia began to unravel, leaving her questioning everything she once knew. The aftermath of the crucifixion. The sky darkened, and the earth seemed to tremble. Claudia saw this as a powerful sign, as if nature itself was rebelling against the death of Jesus. Deep in her heart, she knew that something immense had happened that day. It was not a punishment, but rather a crucifixion of Jesus. What seemed to Claudia like the end of one cycle and the beginning of something she couldn't understand, which would surely change everything forever. After the crucifixion, Claudia withdrew in silence, overcome by a feeling that she would never be the same again. For her, Golgotha was not only a place of death, but also of very important changes in her heart and her faith. Days after his crucifixion, hard-to-believe news began to flow up and down Jerusalem, spreading that Jesus had risen from the dead. The astounded Claudia heard this news with great unbelief. This made no sense. It was impossible beyond the realms of probability. A man died and was going to come back to life. She had considered it nothing but a rumor concocted by his followers. Days went by, though, with every passing hour strengthening this story. Reports were coming from all directions. People claimed to see him walking, talking, and living among his disciples. Claudia was particularly struck when she heard that soldiers and even witnesses from the Roman court itself said that Jesus' body had vanished, though sealed and guarded. This situation was impossible to explain. The more Claudia read, the more she started to feel that she was confronted with a mystery much greater than anything she had ever been through. Something beyond her comprehension, making her look at the world differently. The resurrection had both devastating and transforming effects on Claudia. She remembered her dream, the feeling from the very beginning that this man was different, and how she now realized she was witnessing something sacred, an event beyond human limits. She knew in her heart that it was a sign, a divine manifestation. Jesus hadn't been just any man. His death and resurrection carried meaning beyond time and space. Her heart was filled with a mix of fear and reverence. If Jesus had risen from the dead, then all he had preached was true, and the love and peace so oft spoken about had a deep and eternal purpose. She felt transformed, as if a veil had been removed from her eyes, revealing a new truth, a new faith. From that moment on, Claudia lived with the certainty that she had witnessed the most extraordinary miracle anyone could ever see. The resurrection of Jesus changed not only her understanding of what is sacred, but also left a mark that would remain with her for the rest of her life, an event in which she would be eternally linked with the world-changing effects of his resurrection. Claudia's journey from doubt to faith reminds us that sometimes the greatest truths come from the most unexpected places. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales from history.